for, and then I will stop recording when we enter our conversation. So,
Bruce. Got it.
So, Monday is June the 19th, which is known as Juneteenth. It's history for you all. So, and that's a date that is recognized as a date associated with freedom. So I'll start by talking about Juneteenth, a little bit of the history of that, and then I'll move from there to freedom in the context of Buddhism. So why are we talking about Juneteenth in the Buddhist context? Because it's freedom, right? So we'll talk about freedom in the Buddhist context, and then bring the two together, because and just bring the two together. So that's the arc of what I'll talk about today. So, thank you, Anand. Going way back, it's a little bit before Juneteenth, in September the 22nd to be precise, 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, or he signed a document that said that at some future date, the enslaved people in states still in rebellion would be freed. And on January the 1st, 1863, that would be, wouldn't it? He signed that. So the Emancipation Proclamation became law, and all those enslaved people in states in rebellion were freed, except for Texas and those counties in Virginia, which basically form West Virginia, and a couple of others, and whole chunks of Louisiana, which the bits excluded included New Orleans. So not quite perfect, right? Then later that year, there was the movement towards the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery, which Lincoln signed in June 1960. February. I wrote it down. February 1965. But of course, it then had to be ratified by the states for it to go into law. And so while it was going through that process, in June 1965, the federal troops swarmed into Texas, and Juneteenth was the implementation of the Emancipation Proclamation in the state of Texas. Because they were named as freed January the 1st, 1963, but of course it was what you do with that, right? So that's the history of Juneteenth. And January the 1st, I've done this with, I'm sure this is a very common thing, it's not going to be every church, but the DeKalb chapter of the NAACP, every January the 1st, they have a ceremony or a service at a local church, which is around the Emancipation Proclamation, and they're very beautiful. It's just really wonderful. So this is freedom, except for those counties and parts of the enslaved states that weren't freed, and of course that was only the enslaved states where they're in rebellion. All right, so we have the 13th Amendment, and there are some catches there. A famous catch is there can be no enslavement except where somebody's duly convicted of a crime. So now we have the situation in prisons where we have large prison populations, which are disproportionately people of color, who are often find themselves doing work that is forced work for next to nothing. What is that? It's like slavery, right? So there's a wide big hole there that you could drive a truck through. That the obvious truck driving through thing was addressed in the 50s and 60s with the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Act. But today, I was talking a couple of weeks ago with somebody who has a kid who was graduating from high school, and he was reflecting on his son going out to celebrate with his friends and saying, he really needs to be careful because this kid's African American. He says it's not the same for him as for his white friends. And I was in a car. This was maybe a year ago, but it really struck me when the words came up. of my beekeeping, I was going out with a friend and neighbour who's African American, and we were going to go pick up some little starter nucleus hives, and we drove not far east of Atlanta, so it was still, not really rural, but it was a little bit outside Atlanta. And we went off the road and down a couple of little side roads, and she said, if I didn't have my white friend with me today, I'd probably turn back. So there are some things that still today don't quite present as freedom, but this is freedom. So freedom in a Buddhist context. How do we bring these together? So let's talk first of all about freedom in a Buddhist context. Well, the way the teachings generally work and are generally presented, we start off with the basics and some precepts and a little bit of generosity, and then we move into the Noble Eightfold Path and start practicing, and that moves us towards a meditation practice. And that meditation practice becomes settling, developing insight, recognizing I'm not what I think I am, and moving through these absorption states, and finding freedom from this sack of skin and bones. Liberation from body, speech, and mind. That's what we normally think of, right? But that sounds very self-centered. There was a move, the historicity of this is more than somewhat opaque, but somewhere around 2000 to 2200 years, somewhere in there. Some of the Buddhist traditions have become somewhat calcified and list-based, and there was a move to say, well, waking up for yourself ain't enough. This is about helping other people wake up, which in truth is what the Buddha did. He studied with a couple of teachers, found that was profoundly helpful. He reached some very deep states of release, but not complete release. So then he went off on his own and he woke up completely, which means he completely released from, he was completely released. He became consciousness without surface, consciousness that does not land. It was just nothing sticks. There's awareness that can do whatever it likes, but it doesn't stick. What do I do with this, he thought. And he came back and he taught, and he left us. That's why he's up there, and that's the body of teachings we propagate. He came back and he taught. The absorption tradition that is central to so much of Buddhism, it's one that it needs careful holding, because you can really skid off into directions that become a little confused. In the Theravadan tradition, which is what primarily leads into the insight tradition in this country, that comes from the Pali Canon, and that's where the jhanas, as they're described, they're named, talked about, which are these settled absorption states. But it's also very clear in those teachings that the Brahma Viharas, which are goodwill, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, the Brahma Viharas are also gateways to awareness release, awakening. They are also not just subjects for concentration, but in and of themselves they are absorption states. In many of the sutras, many of the sutras, there will be the list of the 4 jhanas with some description, and it goes straight into goodwill or loving kindness, radiating that in the 8 directions, the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 intermediate directions, and then up and down, radiating it boundlessly for the benefit of all beings. This is an absorption state. So the absorption states are actually described as being this total connected state, connected in the suffering with other beings. Goodwill is wishing well for other beings. Compassion, which is the second of the Brahma Viharas, I've heard it described as, and I think is a beautiful way of looking at it, compassion is what goodwill looks like in the face of suffering. And if you actually go back to a tradition that evolved in parallel, which is the yoga tradition as part of the Sanatana Dharma, the Hinduism, in the Yoga Sutras, the yamas, which are the precepts, they include the Brahma Viharas essentially, and in that construct, it is very intentional that you generate goodwill towards people who are doing okay, and you generate compassion towards people who are suffering. So we can't separate this from our practice to awaken ourselves. Part of the practice to awaken ourselves is that including other people is reaching out to everybody else. And in the Mahayana tradition, we've got the Bodhisattvas, one of whom is over there, one of whom is right here. This is wisdom and that's compassion. We have the Bodhisattvas, who are beings who have cultivated, as Buddha did, to a state of profound release, and then said, you know, I'm not ready to call it quits. There's people out there who are suffering. I'm going to come back and help. So, so these two, freedom, Fannie Lou Hamer, who was very influential in the civil rights movement, she said, nobody is free until everybody is free. Those are words that the Buddha could have said. And there's a school of Buddhism, it's probably the largest school of Buddhism in the world, the Pure Land School, which is, we have a session on Thursdays where we talk about, it's more of a study session, and I'll be talking about the Pure Land beginning this week actually. But the Pure Land tradition, there was a Bodhisattva, stories, right? So how much of this is real, how much is stories, who knows? But there's a Bodhisattva who many, many eons ago decided that he did not want to, he was going to be like a hardcore Bodhisattva, and he was going to keep on coming back until he had a path for every living being to be released. Everything. And he's going to carry that himself and not allow himself to stop being reborn until that happened. And the Pure Land is based on the tradition. Well, it's more complicated, but the shortcut is, if you take refuge in Amitabha, or if you take refuge in Amitabha Buddha with sincerity, then you will be reborn in the Pure Land, where Amitabha resides and presides. And once in that Pure Land, there will be no regression. You're not going there to live forever. You're not waking up when you go there. But you're going there, and that's a waypoint from which there's no backsliding, and you will wake up from there in a relatively short period of time. So this is the profundity of that commitment to saving other beings in the extreme, right? In Pure Land Buddhism. Now, there's a way some of this can slip off. Some of our practice can slip off because we become overly focused on the wisdom practice, overly focused on release for this life, for this being, and that can actually become quite egocentric. And there are traps in there where we think we're enlightened and we're really not, right? There's traps all over the place. But we could become really stuck in ourselves as we move on this path. Equally, we can slip the other way. And here's another story from a good friend of mine. She used to work in one of the most well-known Southern civil rights, social justice organizations. She is Muslim, and she was there in a diversity role. Seemed appropriate for everything she was bringing to the table and for her background as well. So one day, one of the leadership came to her and said, I've got a problem, I've got somebody we need to deal with. Okay, well, tell me. Well, this person, white male, said this. Wow, I can see how that will be triggering. Has anybody talked to them? No! Why would we talk to them? We don't want people like that around here. So I can understand where that comes from, right? It's coming from trying to get to where we have good behavior in the world, trying to get to where people don't show up in ways that hurt other people, particularly in that context, ways that cross boundaries of minority and hurt across those fracture lines. But there's no forgiveness in that voice, there's no compassion, there's no hearing, there's no wisdom in that voice. So it's really easy to slip off in the other direction and become kind of militant, not necessarily militant, become of a view that everybody has to show up in these woke ways, to use popular vernacular. And to mandate that, and if you don't, you're a bad person. So that's equally flawed. So it really, the practice, the freedom that we're coming back to here, it really comes from cultivating wisdom and cultivating compassion. And the truth is, those sutras where he lists the jhanas and then the Brahma Viharas and talks about them both in the same kind of way, the truth is, in reality, the two are inseparable. The two are inseparable. And when you realize that, you can't just sit on your butt and do nothing. I'm not going to say what anybody should do. We figure that out for ourselves. Because as we show up in our own sacks of skin and bones, with our own history, with our own family and cultural history, our own karmic history. And from that place, we have particular opportunities, particular callings, particular things that's relevant and useful for us to do. But it's kind of hard once you move down the path where wisdom and compassion are growing together to just not engage in some way. Fannie Lou Hamer also said, and I really like this one, you can pray until you faint, but if you don't get up and try to do something, God ain't going to put it in your lap. So, for us here today, what does that mean? Well, hopefully there's this growing of wisdom. Wisdom is being non-judgmental, seeing, as Ben Connolly, who's a teacher who comes down here from time to time, he's a Zen teacher up at Minnesota Zen Center. He talks about, and he's very much a social activist, he talks about deconstructing systems that cause harm, that cause suffering, deconstructing systems that cause suffering. I think that's just a lovely way of describing this. He doesn't pick bad people, he doesn't even pick bad behaviors. He says there's a system here that's causing suffering. What can we do about that system? I think that's a lovely way of looking at it. So somehow or other, I think that's the invitation to all of us here. And the way we talked about this before here, it's Yogacara, but Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this in his own particular and beautiful way. He talks about each moment we are sowing or we are watering seeds of karma. And we have a choice right now about whether what we sow will be positive, supportive, skillful, helpful, lead towards reduction in suffering, or whether it will be rushed, hasty, ill thought out, unskillful, likely leading to an increase in suffering. We have that choice. So it behooves us to cultivate wisdom, cultivate compassion, and then to pause when we're in the face of suffering. Pause, and then act, and make sure our act is coming out of wisdom and compassion. It's not a one-sided response. And the reminder of Juneteenth is there's a lot of suffering in the world, folks. And a lot of suffering that does not need to be there. We're all embedded in this system. We're all part, we can't say, if only those people, we're all part of this. This is our world.